Good evening, one and all. My name is Zipi Israeli, and I am proud to present to you the National Security and Public Opinion polls of the INSS. All of us read in about that the survey has no sort of pillars to it, and they've made a mistake in the polls, and they really call it somewhat burdensome. But these are kind of quotations that present the disappointment of people's capability of actually predicting what various voting directions, etc., might be. So I wanted to explain what a public opinion poll is, in fact. It explores the preferences of a population, and a survey actually reflects at any given time the public positions. There are those that could be ad hoc, and there are others that actually check things over time. The last ones can do things over time so we can understand trends, and to a certain degree can even help us predict various things and trends. So what I'm going to try and do today is mostly to talk about the public opinion now. And I'll also try and show you what we've done up to now and what has happened up to now and what lessons we can learn and what conclusions we can conclude about the future as well. Now, what is unique in our research? First of all, it's carried out over a number of years. The INSS does so on an ongoing way to see about with an assessment from 1984 onwards. We have a whole kind of database with all those questions that sometimes repeat themselves, and then we can explore and delve very deeply into various trends and processes that we feel are taking place and have taken place actually over a matter of years, and how these impact things that are happening right now. And there are questions that cover nearly all the questions and issues that the INSS does cover. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the interviews are actually held in the people's homes, which are so much better than the internet or telephone polls. And the third issue is that our research is on a very big sample of over 800 participants of the mature population in Israel. That includes the Jewish and Arab population in Israel. I will relate mostly to the Jewish population, and there will be another talk about the actual Muslim population in Israel. Now, we carried out the interviews in November 2016, while there was a sort of relative lull, a security lull in Israel, and the research was also carried out then, but when we previously did that, it was actually during a wave of terror. So it's very interesting because it enabled us to see how the public looked upon states of sort of the security situation during times of terror and during a kind of peaceful time. And one can actually compare these two surveys. And it's very interesting to see the consistency more than anything in a state of crisis and a state that there was no crisis. And it's very interesting to compare the various data. Now, a vote of gratitude before anything else. I would like to thank Dr. Yehuda Ben Meir, who was the manager of the project over the last decade, and thank you personally for all his wisdom and contribution, and also to the managing director, Mr. Isaac Rosenblum from Geocartography, who has helped us with such professionalism and courtesy. And now to the findings. I would like to start with the perception of the public about threats and those that challenge the state of Israel. Over the last year, I think we saw it very nicely in the previous sessions. In the center of the agenda, there were social issues. Yes, those also, even the security issues related to the activities of the IDF rather than external threats. So in the light of that, we asked them whether the public was more anxious about the security external threats, or were they more frightened of the social internal sort of gnawing away at things? And yes, they said, of course, this was a very grave situation, but they're also anxious about 33% were more They were more worried about the internal issues, and in some cases, even it was equal standing, actually, that they were worried about the external ones and the internal ones. In other words, they saw the internal threats as something real and solid. Now, which out of these threats, when we talk about the external threats, is the greatest of all? That one that is truly facing the state of Israel. As you can see from the graph, the security threat, which they believe is the gravest of all, comes from the Palestinian arena. And if you connect the 27% of the BDS and the boycotts, etc., which are directly connected to the actual conflict, then we get 56% of the public that considers that the greatest threat of all on the state of Israel. Now, if you mark that as a central issue, that was already in the previous survey when there was an actual wave of terror a year ago. And here you can see a significant increase in the way they relate to this conflict as compared to the previous ones from the previous years. 2014, only 19% thought that this was a central threat. So this is a true increase, a significant increase. So you can learn from that that the Israeli population believes that that is an issue that really does need to be dealt with. Now, vis-a-vis Iran, that actually doesn't actually worry the public as much at the moment, and I'm stressing at the moment, 20% last year, and I think that because it was connected to the actual agreement that was signed in 2015. Now, what happened in the surveys in the past, for example, in 2012, we thought when it was a burning issue, then we saw then Iran as the most severe threat of all. So we can see that they have internalized the population on an immediate sort of level, that the nuclear agreement has not detrimentally affected the state of Israel. Vis-a-vis Hezbollah, the Israeli population does not believe that the Hezbollah is a significant threat. Only 12% believe that it is. We have to stress that this is not what the actual security forces have said, because they relate to that as the most significant threat. So how do we explain the gaps between these? And I'll propose an explanation, because it simply isn't on the media agenda, and the public therefore doesn't feel it immediately as a threat. And of course, they also have a short-term memory. After all, they've had a few months of quiet, so they understand that the Hezbollah is involved and busy with other things. Vis-a-vis ISIS, you can see 11% only. And even over time, they really are not perceived as a central threat to the state of Israel, which is actually very different from what the actual the Europeans think. So, and after the multiplicity of the terror events in Europe, therefore they related as such. So if this is the perception of the threat, what does the actual public think about the state of Israel's capability to grapple successfully with the following threats? So what can the state of Israel grapple with? According to the public, they believe that Israel can actually grapple very successfully with most of the external threats. And the data that I'm showing you are very consistent for the last decade. On the other hand, the public believes that Israel will succeed less in the three following challenges. First of all, is the polarization of things. They really are things that concern the public, and Israel is not convinced that they'll be able to actually succeed in grappling with that kind of situation. They believe that there's from 85% to 67% believe that they'll be able to grapple with these three following issues. The second challenge is Iran's capability of actually attacking Israel with nuclear arms. That's also consistent in our findings. We saw that beforehand that the Israelis do not see Iran as an immediate threat, but we can see that they are worried by this issue. And beforehand, it was an existential threat. That is the way they perceived it. But nowadays, at the moment, they are certain that they're actually not going to stop from actually producing the nuclear arms. Now, in the graph, you can see a narrowing of the fact that America is going to support Israel less. In the past year, only 50% thought that they would succeed in contending with this situation of less support. In 2009, for example, 79% believed that Israel would be able to grapple with that challenge. But now there's an understanding of the crucial issue of America supporting us, and that has increased over the years. And they are very, very aware of the actual special ties between us and our main ally. And here on the tip of the iceberg, you can see how the IDF is, for example, how they will be able to cope with it. You can see that the public believe that they are ready to actually grapple with any kind of external threat, that the IDF is well prepared for that, a full majority that is, and that it is Israel who is succeeding in deterring any future rounds with the Hezbollah. If we talk about the external threats, Israel actually will be able to grapple. Now, if we speak about the actual Palestinian threat conflict, is one that really troubles the public more than anything else, and I will explain what these issues are as I expand on it. I asked the question, this expected question, whether do you support or not support the two-nation solution, the two-state solution, and you can see that there's actually very similar to actually our survey last year when there was the wave of terror, and just gives you a kind of perspective of time. The public support of a two-state solution was very solid and very actually stable in 2012 till 2014. In other words, even times of crisis and even in times of mundane days and routine times. So we're talking about a 70% support of that. So even if we say in the last 2 years there is a decrease in the support of the idea of a two-state solution, we can still see that it is steadfast despite the polarization, despite the stalemate in the negotiations, and even though this is a significant right-wing government, and despite in 2015 there being a security deterioration. The Hebrew is the correct one. That is the binding one, she is saying. There must have been some kind of query. And what I'm saying is the most correct, in other words, she's saying. If there's any confusion in the actual presentation, and so sorry, I was trying to do English and Hebrew together. Forgive me, I was trying to really help everyone the most. So the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is considered the most rifting kind of factor in Israeli society. And since we are segmentizing things, then we looked at various aspects. But I can say in that context that the very significant difference in the demographic actual segmentation, if you specifically look at the differences between religious and, for example, secular, who really support this side. There's a very big gap if you compare the Likud voters and the Machaneh Tzioni, the Zionist camp of voters. You can see 41%. And, for example, vis-a-vis the Israeli Arabs, you can see that there's over 90% support of that in the last year. So if you take all the figures, then you can say that the bottom line is that the support of all the citizens of a two-state solution is 70%. But, and it's a big but, as you know, that the actual formulation of two-state solution has something that has been really deeply rooted for a number of years, and therefore you have to look at the nitty-gritty. So when we actually present the practical issues of this, then there's a more complex situation. For example, if we spoke about having a referendum, or we really went into the nitty-gritty, then we see that there is less support, but we're still talking about a high level of support. In other words, the public want a separation from the Palestinians in one way or another, and you can assume if they would bring an agreement similar to a referendum, that there would be even higher support, because there's a very high percentage of people, of 83%, who really hesitate and they're vacillating. They really don't know where they stand. Now, another question that we added this year gives us a more accurate picture when we give more options to the public, and that's a more interesting picture. So we asked, what is the best option for Israel vis-a-vis the conflict in the near coming future? And most of the public do not want a continuation of this situation or an annexation of the territories of Judea and Samaria. 17%, for example, only 17% want a continuation of the ongoing situation in the moment. A majority want some kind of arrangement, some kind of settlement. If it's not the actual kind of final status settlement, at least they want something that would be an interim status that would lead to the final status agreement. Even amongst the religious and the right voters, they object to the status quo. What does that mean?
The general public understand the problems of a binational country. They fear that. They understand that the passive policy that Israel has adopted and these solutions are very detrimental in the long run. So between the perception that, the time that passes works in favor of Israel and the approach that the more the time passes, it is against the general population determines that it works to the detriment. As you can see in the next slide, we gauged what happened when the public encounters values that often clash. We asked, what is the most important value for you? And ultimately, I can tell you that through political values, people justify opinions and actions and give them a different meaning. And this chart is very important. And this is something that the Institute has been monitoring for many years. And you can see that the vast majority, the most important value for them is a country with the Jewish majority. So we can see the importance attributed to Jewish majority by the public. And over the perspective of time, by the way, we see an increase in the past decade of the importance of this value. And that can at least partially explain how much people don't want to see annexation and the things we saw in the previous slide. Now, the desire to separate is also expressed in their references to the heart of the disagreement. And in the heart of the disagreement, these are the settlements. We asked, what kind of policy should Israel adopt regarding construction in the settlements? And the vast majority, as you can see, would like to build either only in the blocks or not to build. 20% are not interested at all. 38% say only to build in the blocks, and some say that only for natural growth purposes. And that's interesting. That means that if children are born in existing settlements, then you need schools, you need baby clinics, but nothing beyond that. So we have 21% who want a major construction momentum. Now, what does the general public think about the evacuation of settlements? And this is a permanent status agreement. What is your position regarding the evacuation of Jewish settlements as part of a permanent status agreement? Most of the population, 67%, are willing to evacuate settlements as part of a permanent status agreement. 16% are willing to evacuate everything. And so we have two aspects here. One is that two-thirds, as you can see, are willing to evacuate settlements in one way or another. The Jewish population, as we've seen, distinguishes between the blocks and the more isolated localities and settlements. And as you can see in the next slide, the Israelis are also willing to evacuate without a permanent status agreement independently. That's 60% unilaterally. And let me emphasize the unilateral story here, because if in the past, after the disengagement, the Israelis have objected to unilateral evacuation, it's not that you have a majority for it, but there's less objection. I guess the fact that more years have passed since the disengagement and the absence of negotiations and the terrorism from last year, that made it less rejected, this option. So if I sum up the two graphs that you've seen, we see that the Israelis do feel much fear towards evacuation, but they are aware of the fact that it is impossible to reach any kind of solution without conceding certain territories. And the result, and when we check it's over specific territories, it stands out even more clearly. You can see that there's a certain broad range of approaches towards different areas that reflect the emotional connection or the different rational connection that Israelis feel towards certain place. They attribute security, historic or religious meanings to these places. You can see how consistently over the past decade it has been inconceivable to give back the west of the Sharon, Gush Etzion, and the Jordan area. And you see that as for giving back settlements that are not part of the blocks, you have 69% supporting that. And by the way, last year there's tremendous importance to the wording, because last year the wording was handing over the isolated settlements, and this year we worded it in a more subtle way, but still the percentage of support rose. Hebron, that's an emotional story. We see an increase. If in 2009 29% agreed to transfer it, and today there are 40%. And this brings up the question whether, as a result of the constant friction or an increase in terrorist attacks last year, does this lead to that? That's an open question. And finally, regarding the conflict, we also checked the attitudes towards the other side. For example, what are the aspirations of the Palestinians? To what extent do most Palestinians want peace, etc.? Let me show you one very interesting finding in this context, and that's the question, how should Israel behave towards the PA? And you can see that 24% are in favor of strengthening the PA, 57 are in favor of not intervening, and 19% are in favor of completely wiping it out. So what does that mean? The majority of the public, as you can see, would like to strengthen or not to intervene. And of course, I mean, there's a conflict here between the emotions and the logic, because the head says there are friends. The PA is not perceived as Israel's biggest friend. That's the heart. But the head says this is an Israeli interest. It seems that the Israeli people understand that without the PA, things could be worse. So they don't want to sever this cord. So in other words, at least the logic, the mind wins in this case over the heart. And now, before we finish, a few words about the domestic arena. As we saw at the beginning, this is of great concern to Israelis in this past year. The questions I presented were mainly on the macro level, but of course, we also had to ask a micro level question on an issue that preoccupied Israelis, and we'd like to learn from that on other matters. Of course, I'm referring to Elor Azaria. We asked, what do you think about how the IDF treated the soldier Elor Azaria? You see that the majority of the public, 73%, think that the IDF was too strict with him and portrayed him to be guilty before the trial, and only 27% think that the IDF took the right approach. Now, it seems that our findings are similar to other polls that were published very often during this past year. But let me just point out a certain point, and I think that there are certain things that are difficult to measure quantitatively through polls, and I'd like to make a distinction between public support for the soldier and support for his act. And once again, we go back to this distinction I already mentioned between the heart and the mind, and it seems that at least outwardly the heart won, because the reaction of the people immediately after the incident in Hebron was the gut instinct behavior, the knee-jerk reaction that with respect to soldiers, there's always backing and support and identifying with them. Every soldier, definitely if he's a combat soldier, definitely if he's a combat soldier in action, the mind, and I'm not saying that this is true for everyone, but many people among Israelis understand that this was an inadequate act, but not all of them did. We see any signs that were concerning to us in the discourse? Yes, and I'll refer to that later. So the general population is not necessarily against the military or the Chief of General Staff on this issue, and the numbers indirectly support what I'm saying. So let's look at this slide now. We asked whether the ideological disputes affect the IDF, and most people think that they have a detrimental effect on the IDF. 81% thought so, and we need to understand that these are different considerations and different worldviews of different sectors of the population, and yet we can learn that the general public, as we've seen in studies over time, would like to keep the IDF outside of the controversies and disputes. They want to keep it the people's army, and about 70% of the people are not satisfied with the vast media and public discourse regarding Elor Azarian. They think that it is harmful to the IDF. One last question, whether the set of values guiding the senior commanding echelon of the IDF, is it close or distant to the set of values of most Israelis? And you can see that the majority of the public, 69%, think that the set of values is close. So we saw to what extent public trust there's much public trust in the military, and this finding also in a certain way reflects the public's trust in the IDF, and it also is complementary to the two other slides. And the attitudes toward the IDF crosses every segmentation, whether it's religious, gender, political, and there's something here that's more complicated, because the IDF, and this is something that came up in previous sessions, it's not an ordinary military, it's a military with ongoing dialogue with the civilians, and maintaining trust relations between society and the IDF is an important component of national security as well. So in conclusion, what have we learned? We saw that the general population are concerned with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and also with domestic social issues. We saw that the general population still believe in a political solution and are willing to give back some of these settlements. And we saw that this was stable over the years. We saw that some of the core issues are challenging the status quo. And I would like to suggest two conclusions or points for thought. The first one, from our research, it turns the silent voice comes up, and unlike the vociferous discourse that we hear on the extremes, what comes up in our research is the middle ground, the sane voice, that their positions, the people whose positions are quite stable over time. What about the vociferous discourse in the extremes? The fact that it seems very violent and extreme, and you can hear it mainly in the world of talkbacks and social media. Perhaps there was always such a violence violent discourse, but now it is amplified. You can hear it loud and clear over the Facebook. And I can tell you in parenthesis, without undermining the power of the social media, most of the people say that the traditional media outlets, especially TV, are what impact their security and political worldview. Now, sociological studies indicate that the social media do not touch upon the consensus, but mainly, I love this expression, they create tunnels, reverberating or echoing tunnels where you hear one uniform voice where nobody listens to the other side, and therefore they mainly serve radicalization and polarization of opinions and positions, and encourage expressions of incitement and hatred. And if this voice still doesn't characterize the majority of the public, it's still important to pay attention to it, because it is, after all, a voice that amplifies the polarization that's a source of concern for the general population. And maybe it's indicative of a process that the Israeli society is undergoing, and the realization of certain parts of the society what a democracy actually means. Time will tell what the future of this voice is, but Israeli leadership, and this came up here quite often, the Israeli leadership has a significant role in calming things down and stopping these violent voices and in showing the path. And this takes me to my second point, which also came up here in various variations, and the discourse around the conflict is based on the paradigm that was shaped after the Oslo Accords of a two-state solution, or on the other hand, to continue the existing situation, the status quo. But if we look at the findings and if we read between the lines, you can decipher that the solution doesn't have to be dichotomous. The people, the general population, can support new solutions, new ideas. We see that the findings leave a lot of space for leadership creativity. Just like a child needs a parental authority, just like a child looks up to the parent, doesn't matter who the parent is, they're always looking for answers from the parents, and thus the people look up, people expect leadership, and I'm not certain that the current existing leadership is using that credit given to it by the public as we see here. Thank you very much.